Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Lee Beck. I'm the Senior Advisor for Advocacy and Communications at the Global CCS Institute's Washington, D.C. office, and we're so excited to welcome you to today's webinar. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Global CCS Institute, we are an international think tank currently represented in 7 countries and backed by governments, companies, and NGOs. We were founded in 2009 by the Australian government, and our mission is to accelerate the deployment of carbon capture and storage within an energy transition that reduces emissions to net zero by mid-century. We're extremely happy to welcome you to this fantastic discussion today, which will focus on the Carbon Capture and Storage Protocol to the Low Carbon Fuel Standard in California, which took effect earlier this year. During this webinar, my colleagues Alex Townsend, who is in our London office, and Ian Havercroft, who is in Melbourne, and who are both senior consultants at the Institute, will be discussing a report we released recently which details the regulation. And the report is called the Low Carbon Fuel Standard and CCS Protocol. It's an overview for policymakers and project developers, and we encourage you to download it on our website for free. So before we begin, we just wanted to emphasize this is a very exciting discussion for us. From the Institute's view, the protocol is an extremely significant development, and we strongly welcome the California Air Resources Board initiative on this matter. So first of all, it not only comes on the heels of other important climate policy announcements, including, for example, the 100% zero carbon electricity mandate and the aim for a net zero economy by 2045, but it's also, in our view, an acknowledgement by the state of California, which is arguably one of the most climate ambitious states from both a national and global perspective, that carbon capture and storage will be needed with rising climate ambition. So before I hand it over to Ian and Alex, we just wanted to emphasize that we would love for you to submit any questions you might have throughout the presentation, and you can do this, you can see it on the screen right now, through the questions tab on the GoToWebinar control panel on your screen. We will then have a moderated discussion at the end of the webinar and hopefully address all of the questions, but if we're not able to answer all of the questions today, we encourage you to reach out to us. We will share our email addresses at the end of the session, and we encourage all of you to reach out to us directly with any further questions. Thanks so much for joining. Ian and Alex, over to you.
Thank you for the introduction, Lee. I'm Ian Havercroft, the Senior Consultant for Law and Regulation here at the Institute, and I lead our legal and regulatory analysis here. And I'm joined, as Lee said, by my colleague, Alex Townsend.
Hello, I'm Alex Townsend. I'm also a Senior Consultant at the Institute, and I lead our economic analysis.
So thank you, Alex. During this webinar, we're going to provide you with a summary of our report, which, as Lee suggested, we published in May, the LCFS and CCS Protocol, an overview for policymakers and project developers. We're going to kick off with an introduction to the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, explain its origin and how it works. We'll then discuss the types of CCS projects that are able to qualify and generate LCFS credits following the recent changes made to the program and the requirements they need to meet. We will then provide a comparison of the CCS protocol to other regulations in the US, namely the UIC program and the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. And then we'll finish up with a discussion on the links to the 45Q tax credit. So let's start with an overview of the LCFS. In the next few slides, we'll give you some background to the standard and explain how it all works. So the LCFS, which was introduced under executive order in 2007, is one of several policies announced in California as a response to the state's Global Warming Solutions Act from 2006, or AB 32. This program is administered by the California Air Resources Board, or CARB, as we're going to refer to it, which under the Federal Clean Air Act has primacy to regulate greenhouse gas emissions in California. The aim of the LCFS is to encourage the use of cleaner low carbon fuels in California, encourage their production, and therefore reduce greenhouse gas emissions. For transport fuels in particular, the aim is to reduce their life cycle emissions when sold within the state. And to achieve this aim, the standard establishes a market-based policy which sets carbon intensity benchmarks on transport fuels, which are then sold, supplied, or offered the sale in the state. The LCFS places separate benchmarks upon gasoline, diesel and jet fuel, as well as fuels which also replace them. The intensity benchmarks will reduce over time to 2030, with the ultimate aim of reducing the carbon intensity of the state's transport fuel mix by 20%, and that's relative to 2010 levels. And Alex is now going to examine this approach in a little more detail.
Thanks, Ian. So let's look at how the LCFS works. As Ian mentioned, CARB sets annual carbon intensity targets in each year for gasoline and diesel. Fuels with a higher carbon intensity than the target generate deficits, and fuels with a lower carbon intensity than the target generate credits. Fuel providers in California, that is any organization that sells, supplies, or offers to sell transport fuels in California, must in each year retire enough credits to cover any deficits they have generated from the sale of high carbon intensity fuels. Fuel providers have several options available to achieve compliance in a given year. They can use credits banked from previous years, so credits can be banked indefinitely, which means a fuel provider can roll over any over-compliance in one year into future years. They can buy credits from another fuel provider in California or an opted-in credit generator. So these credit transactions get recorded in CARB's data management system, and CARB regularly publishes information on the price and volume of credits traded. They can also increase the production or imports of low carbon intensity fuels, or reduce production or imports of high carbon intensity fuels. They can change production methods to make them less carbon intensive, or they can transfer ownership of the fuel and compliance requirements through a written contract to another party. At the end of each year, fuel providers are required to submit an annual compliance report, which includes a summary of their credit balance. If, after totting up all their deficits and credits, they still have an overall deficit, the fuel providers must purchase additional credits on the credit clearance market, often referred to as CCM, to make up any shortfall. The CCM is designed to provide additional compliance flexibility, and it's also a cost containment mechanism, with the market price of credits traded on the CCM capped at $200 per tonne of CO2 in 2016 prices, rising with inflation. In the early years of the LCFS program, fuel providers generally overcomplied with their targets. This is shown in the chart on the left, with the light blue line showing the carbon intensity target set by carbon each year, and the dark line showing the reported reduction in carbon intensity of the fuel sold in California. The excess credits generated during the early years can be used to ease compliance. And this was the case in 2018, which is the first year where the number of credits generated was less than the number of deficits generated, as illustrated here in the graph with the crossing of the light blue and the dark blue lines. As the targets become more stringent in order to reach the 2030 goal of reducing the carbon intensity of fuels by 20% relative to 2010, the availability of bank credits is likely to play an ever more important role in achieving compliance. And you can see here the scale of the challenge that's required in terms of the orange line, which shows the future compliance targets. The main source of the credits generated over the course of the program have been from the sale of ethanol, which is blended with gasoline to reduce its carbon intensity. This accounts for around 40% of all the credits generated, as shown by the chart on the right. Renewable diesel and biodiesel have also been significant sources of credits generated to date, accounting for around 25% and 15% of credits generated respectively. As I mentioned earlier, CARB regularly publishes information on the average value of LCFS credits traded between fuel providers, and the reported monthly average price of LCFS credits is shown in this chart. The price of credits has been on an upward trend since the program started, but at the same time has been highly volatile. In the early years of the program, credit values were low primarily due to the ongoing legal challenges against the program, which ultimately reduced the confidence in the programme and therefore suppressed prices. Following the conclusion of these legal challenges and the recognition of the tightening in the current and the future availability of credits, the value of credits has climbed, and credits are currently trading at around $180 per tonne of CO2, providing a strong price signal for actions that reduce the carbon intensity of fuels.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Alex. In 2018, the CARB approved amendments to the LCFS, an extension which will allow CCS projects to now generate credits. These amendments entered into force in January 2019. Both policymakers and project proponents have viewed these developments as potentially significant step in supporting the deployment of the technology, particularly given the value at which credits are currently trading, as Alex just discussed in the previous slide. We have now examined the background and operation of the standard, so our next few slides will examine the impact of these amendments and how CCS projects specifically may qualify for the LCFS, how they can generate credits, and how they may support compliance under the LCFS. So in this slide, which Alex presented earlier, we've highlighted the range of options available to fuel providers to ensure they have sufficient credits for a particular year. Here you can see that CCS projects could be used to support compliance in two ways. A fuel provider that has an overall deficit is able to purchase credits from another fuel provider that has installed CCS and is generating credits. Alternatively, the fuel provider that has the overall deficit could change their own production processes, installing CCS at their own fuel production facilities to reduce the carbon intensity of the fuels produced and then generate credits. And Alex will examine the operational side to these two methods a little later in this webinar. Under the revised LCFS, a broad range of CCS projects may qualify and be able to generate credits under the scheme. And this slide gives you a snapshot of the variety of projects which may qualify to generate credits. As may be seen from the slide, there are various requirements applicable to each type of operation, including requirements as to the project's location, and you can note that from the direct air capture projects, for example, the crediting methods applicable to particular projects, and the date from which existing projects are eligible under the scheme. Two requirements, however, are common to all projects. Firstly, they must sequester the CO2 onshore in saline or depleted oil and gas reservoirs, including those used for CO2 EOR, and projects must meet the requirements of the CCS Protocol, which we'll discuss a little later on.
Thanks, Ian. So moving on then to our next section. In this section of our presentation, we're going to talk through the CCS Protocol in more detail. The protocol is effectively split into two sections. One section covers the permanence requirements and the other covers the accounting requirements. The permanence requirements specify what project operators need to do to ensure and demonstrate the long-term storage of CO2. And the accounting requirements, on the other hand, when read in conjunction with the main LCFS regulation order, explain how to estimate the emissions reductions and number of credits a CCS project generates. So Ian will run through the permanence requirements first, and then I'll run through the accounting requirements after that.
Thanks, Alex. As Alex has suggested, a claim for credits under the LCFS will require that an operator demonstrates compliance with the permanence requirements of the CCS protocol. For an operator to demonstrate the suitability of their storage site, they'll be required to secure what's termed permanent certification, and that's also comprised of sequestration site certification and CCS project certification. These elements are effectively aimed at ensuring the integrity of a storage site and the operational practices of an operator throughout the project's lifecycle. In the next few slides, I'm going to take us through the various requirements and what they mean for project operators in a practical sense. So the first area I'm going to consider is the area of site characterization and risk assessment. A sequestration site will be required to satisfy several criteria. in order to meet the permanence requirements of the protocol. A site will be required to be certified by a professional geologist, and several specific requirements are to be met. And these include issues in relation to the volume of the site, the porosity, permeability, and injectivity, for example. In addition, and as can be seen on this slide, there are a number of other specific actions which are to be completed by an operator. These include modeling requirements and the completion of an assessment and management plan in line with the 100-year post-injection site care point that I will mention a little bit later on. Next area is well construction and corrective action. Again, the operator of a storage site, again throughout the project's lifetime, has a number of obligations in relation to well construction and corrective actions. There are several specific actions which apply to the construction of wells. Notably, they're to be constructed in a way that prevents the movement of fluids into unauthorized zones, allows appropriate testing, and permits continuous monitoring of pressure. In a manner similar to many other regulatory models worldwide, which require the preparation of plans and programs prior to operation, any subsequent amendments to the well construction plan must be approved. The protocol also requires that materials used in the construction of wells meets or exceeds international standards. Several tests, including step rate tests or pressure fall-off tests, for example, must be undertaken to confirm the characteristics of the site, baseline data, and conformance with well requirements. And a further report must be submitted demonstrating how corrective action has addressed or remediated any potential issues with the storage complex, which may have been caused by other wells. During the operational lifetime of a project, the protocol requires specific practices to be observed. The injection pressure, for example, is not to exceed 80% of the fracture pressure of the sequestration zone. Injection itself must not cause fractures in the confining zone or induce seismicity, nor must it result in the movement out of the storage complex of injection or formation fluids. Wells are to be maintained, and well maintenance conducted at least every 6 months under the protocol. In instances where mechanical integrity is compromised or there is a suspected leak, operators must implement their emergency plan, and this includes notifying the relevant executive officer. Linked to this are the twin issues of testing and monitoring. And testing and monitoring of a storage site is a very significant aspect of the permanence requirements. A project operator is required to prepare, maintain and comply with a plan for testing and monitoring, which will ensure that the CCS project is operating as certified and that CO2 that is injected is permanently sequestered. Monitoring is to continue for at least 100 years post-injection. There are several more specific requirements which are introduced, and these relate to topics such as injection rate and volume and wellhead and downhole pressure monitoring. The CO2 plume must be re-evaluated and revalidated at least every 5 years to confirm the plume is within the storage complex. Internal mechanical integrity of a well must be demonstrated prior to injection and at least every 5 years thereafter. Corrosion testing of well materials is to be undertaken. Well heads, valves, pipelines, and surface equipment inspections are to be undertaken also. Well, the eventual completion of storage activities and the plugging and abandonment of wells, including injection, production, and monitoring wells, must also be undertaken in accordance with a plan prepared by the operator. The operator is required to notify the executive officer at least 30 days prior to plugging, converting, or abandoning a well under the protocol, and written approval must be received before the plugging operations can be completed. Within 60 days of plugging a well, the operator is to submit a well plugging report, which confirms that the correct plugging method has been used and that the well was found to be free from leaks. The post-injection site care requirements of the protocol have received considerable attention in the consultations surrounding these amendments to the LCFS. And once all injection activity has been completed, a project operator must comply with their previously submitted post-injection site care and site closure plan. All injection and production wells must be plugged within 24 months of injection completion, and note here that monitoring wells may remain open during this post-injection site care period. No earlier than 15 years post-injection, the operator is able to submit evidence to the CARB that the CO2 plume has stabilized, and upon approval from the CARB, any remaining wells may be plugged and abandoned, suggesting securely and permanently sealed. And the operator is required then to implement a leak detection strategy. Site closure may only occur at least 100 years after injection has been completed. And once approved, the operator is released of their post-injection site care duties. The final element in this, and a further and perhaps complementary aspect to the permanence requirements of the protocol, are those obligations surrounding insurance and financial mechanisms. Under the LCFS, CCS projects which are seeking credit issuance are required to contribute to something termed the buffer account, which you can see on the top left-hand side of this slide. Between 8 and 16.4% of the credits generated by a project are to be contributed, and that's in line with the project's risk rating. These credits may then be invalidated in instances where CO2 subsequently migrates beyond the storage complex or is emitted to the atmosphere. For up to 50 years post-injection, credits are to be taken from the contribution to the buffer account which was made by an individual project. Where instances of leakage, for example, are greater than this amount, operators are required to then surrender credits to cover the remaining balance from either those credits that they've generated from the project or by purchasing additional credits. Following this 50-year period, the credits contributed by all parties to the account are then available to be to cover any invalid credits. CO2 is considered permanently stored once it is in the storage site for 100 years. In addition to the buffer account requirements, an operator is also required to maintain sufficient financial instruments to cover potential endangerment to human health and the environment, which may be caused by leakage. The instruments must be capable of covering the cost of performing corrective actions, for example, the plugging of wells, the post-injection site care, emergency and remedial responses. The calculation or the requirements of these instruments must be based upon the cost of retaining a third party to undertake these activities, potentially in instances where an operator ceases to exist prior to the eventual site closure. The protocol itself identifies a host of instruments which may be capable of satisfying this requirement, for example, escrow, trust bonds, surety bonds, insurance, for example, insurance, self-insurance. And as part of this, the operator is required to maintain a written estimate of the cost of these potential remediation activities.
Great, thanks Ian. So Ian's talked through the permanence requirements of the CCS protocol. As I mentioned earlier, the other part of the CCS protocol covers the accounting requirements. When read in conjunction with the main LCFS regulation order, this explains how to estimate the emissions reductions and number of credits the CCS project generates, and the process for applying for and being awarded LCFS credits. There are two routes through which CCS projects can receive credits: project-based crediting, shown here on the left, and fuel pathway-based crediting. Under project-based crediting, CCS project operators earn credits directly based on emissions reductions achieved. Crediting for projects is based on lifecycle emissions, which in the case of a CCS project is equal to the volume of CO2 injected minus the greenhouse gas emissions associated with capturing, transporting, and injecting the CO2, and any indirect land use change from the project. Fuel pathway-based crediting is a bit more complex. To earn credits under the fuel pathway approach, providers of low carbon fuels first need to obtain a certified carbon intensity score for the fuel they produce. Low carbon fuels could include CCS in production processes, but fuel providers would also need to take into account the life cycle emissions elsewhere along the supply chain in estimating the carbon intensity score. So, for example, in the case of ethanol production, where CCS is applied at the biorefinery, the fuel provider would need to estimate the emissions associated with the production of the feedstock, the emissions at the biorefinery, and the emissions from the transport and distribution of the fuel. Once a carbon intensity score has been approved by CARB, the fuel provider can then estimate the number of credits generated by subtracting the carbon intensity score awarded from the carbon intensity benchmark, and then multiplying this by the energy economy ratio, which takes into account differences in the ability of a fuel to be converted to drive, and by a predetermined conversion factor, as shown here in the table. Under both the fuel pathway and project-based crediting approaches, CCS operators can choose to either report and verify credit generation estimates on a quarterly or an annual basis. And credits are awarded to the capture facility, but the storage facility must be a co-applicant.
Thanks, Alex. The next few slides, we're going to undertake a comparison of the protocol to wider regulatory programs within the United States. All projects in the US which inject CO2 into the subsurface are also required to hold a permit in accordance with the Federal Underground Injection Control Program. The UIC was created under the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act, or the SDWA, and seeks to ensure public health, the protection of underground sources of drinking water through the regulation of individual injection wells. Any US project seeking to apply for LCFS credits will also be obliged to meet the permitting requirements of this particular program. And while it's not possible to provide an exhaustive analysis today of all the requirements applicable to projects, in the next two slides, I'm going to try and provide some of the more salient aspects of these regulations. So the first is the underground injection control and greenhouse gas reporting programs. And as you'll see from this slide, which is taken from our report, we've tried to highlight the variety of obligations and opportunities applicable to a project which is seeking credit under the LCFS, as well as projects more generally in the US. And to note in particular here are the two items on the left-hand side of the diagram, those obligations owing both under the UIC program and the EPA's greenhouse gas reporting program. Under the UIC program, two particular well classes and associated permitting models are relevant in the context of CO2 injection. Class 2, concerning the injection of fluids associated with oil and gas activities and includes EOR operations, and then Class 6, which concerns the injection of CO2 into geological formations for the purposes of long-term storage. Both of these well classes are to be permitted in accordance with the scheme, something we'll consider in the next slide in a little more detail. In addition to the permitting requirements, operators injecting CO2 will also be required to comply with the EPA's greenhouse gas reporting program. For operators undertaking Class 6 activities, the provisions of subpart RR of the program apply, and this requires the reporting of the amount of CO2 injected, produced and emitted, essentially the amount sequestered, and operators must also have an EPA approved MRV plan. For those undertaking Class 2 activities, operators are obliged to report under subpart UU the amount of CO2 which has been received for injection. And it should be noted here that Class 2 operators may also choose to opt in to the subpart RR reporting methodology. A further important point to make in relation to these regulations is the issue of primacy, notably a state's application for primary enforcement authority of the scheme. To date, in the United States, there are 41 states that have received primacy for the regulation of Class 2 wells, and one state, North Dakota, has received primacy for Class 6 operations. The question from operators likely is therefore how obligations under these existing regulatory models differ from the requirements of the CCS protocol. And we've put together a table which you can see on this slide, a very high level comparison of class 2 and 6 wells and the requirements, and comparing them in the requirements of the CCS protocol. So green sections here highlight clear similarities. Those in amber or orange are those where there are smaller similarities but important differences, and red where we perceive clear distinctions. It should be noted that in this comparison for class 2, we've assumed that they're reporting under subpart RR, so we're actually comparing like with like here. And reporting under subpart UU would reveal perhaps more stark differences. Now, while again it's not possible to provide a sort of provide an exhaustive analysis of all 3 regimes, it's clear that there are some very significant differences and indeed similarities between the various models. The requirements for class 2 wells are clearly less prescriptive than those of the CCS protocol. There's financial responsibility requirements, perhaps narrower. There's differences around the injection pressure requirements, and operators are not required to complete the post-injection site care requirements. And we'd suggest it would be perhaps more difficult for class 2 permit holders reporting under subpart RR to meet the requirements of the CCS protocol without some changes to their operations. For class 6 operations, there are far fewer inconsistencies with the requirements of the CCS protocol. But notwithstanding this, there are still some distinctions between the 2 regimes. The operating requirements and injection pressure are perhaps one clear example. Similarly, the post-injection site care requirement of 50 years, which is, or indeed shorter. As a consequence, class 6 operators will also need to consider potential changes to meet the requirements of the CCS protocol.
So as well as the interest in the differences between the LCFS and UIC program and the greenhouse gas reporting program, there's been a lot of interest in the potential to combine or stack LCFS credits and 45Q tax credits. In combination, this could provide incentive CCS projects equivalent to over $200 per tonne of CO2 at the prevailing credit values. I'm sure many of you on the webinar today will be familiar with 45Q, but for those less familiar, this slide here provides a brief overview of the scheme. So 45Q tax credits provide capture operators in the US with credits for each tonne of CO2 stored or utilised that can be used to reduce their tax liability. The scheme was introduced in 2008 under the Energy Improvement and Extension Act and recently amended under the Bipartisan Budget Act. Perhaps the most notable amendment made under the Bipartisan Budget Act was the increase in the value of the incentive. So under the revised scheme, the tax credit for CO2 injected for dedicated geological storage ramps up to $50 per tonne of CO2 by 2026. And for CO2 used for enhanced oil recovery or other utilisation purposes, the value ramps up to $35 per tonne of CO2 by 2026. And from 2026 onwards, those values are indexed to inflation, as shown in the table in this slide. The Act included a number of other significant changes, such as the removal of the cap on the total number of credits that can be claimed for new projects, the expansion of emissions covered to include the capture of all carbon oxides and not just carbon dioxide, the inclusion of direct air capture as a qualifying project, and the introduction of new eligibility criteria for projects, including the requirement to have started construction by the start of 2024 to qualify. While the Act has laid the foundation for the new scheme, the IRS is currently consulting on additional regulations and guidance needed to implement it in full. In particular, the IRS is seeking comments on what constitutes geological storage, the approach to recapturing credits in the event of a leak, and the definition of the start of construction, amongst other topics. The consultation is due to close in the coming month, and thereafter the IRS will take a decision on the guidance and regulation that need to be issued to implement the changes. Being able to stack LCFS credits and 45Q tax credits relies on being able to meet the eligibility requirements of both schemes, which we've summarised in our report, and this is summarised in this table. This highlights several overlaps between the LCFS and 45Q, but also some differences that would mean a CCS project would not be eligible to qualify for both in some cases. The main differences between the two are the geographic scope. So for example, direct air capture projects outside the US could generate LCFS credits, as Ian mentioned earlier on, whereas 45Q is restricted to the US. The types and size of projects that qualify, particularly with the minimum size threshold in place under 45Q and the inclusion of CO2 utilization projects other than CO2 EOR in that scheme, and the emissions covered and qualification periods, mainly with the requirement to be under construction by 2024 to qualify for the 45Q tax credit scheme, which does not exist under the LCFS. There are also likely to be differences between the approach taken to credit invalidation and the permanence requirements a project needs to meet. But in the case of 45Q, these are subject to the ongoing consultation, and therefore it's not possible to say yet exactly how they differ to the LCFS.
So thank you, Alex. And that concludes the presentation element on the LCFS and CCS protocol. We would now, however, like to spend some time answering your questions, and on that, I shall hand back to our colleague Lee Beck. Thank you, Lee.
Yes, hello. Sorry, we had some technical difficulties here in DC. So yes, okay, great. So we got a couple of questions, and it seems that people are very interested into the 100-year monitoring requirements. So maybe Ian and Alex, or Ian in particular, since you're a regulatory expert, you can speak a little bit to how this monitoring requirement compares to other countries and locations, but also how you would evaluate it in terms of possibly being a hindrance to projects or making projects more difficult.
Okay, all right, thanks, Lee. Look, there are some similar requirements in other sort of CCS specific regimes around the world. And I think really what it is, it's the length of the monitoring requirement, which would appear very distinct in the case of the CCS protocol. If you look, for example, at the European Union CCS directive, well, that includes a 20-year post-closure period under its transfer model, and that transfer model effectively concerns the apportionment of risks and liabilities and enables an operator to transfer their liabilities back to the state. That 20-year period under the European model may be shortened when an operator can demonstrate that the CO2 will be completely and permanently contained. But there's another separate element to the directive as well, which is a financial contribution, where an operator is required to cover the cost of monitoring, or the anticipated cost of monitoring, for a period of 30 years. So there are similar provisions in Europe, and there's other examples in Canadian legislation, in the province of Alberta, for example, and here in Australia in the Federal Act, and in the state of Queensland. In relation to how it compares, or whether it may prove a hindrance, if you presume that the extended period is to ensure security and risks of the storage process are addressed, I would suggest, and this is based on a personal view upon sort of a review of current evidence and R&D, for example, reports, that this is perhaps a little cautious. 100 years obviously is notably far longer than the other model I just, the European model, for example, that I just mentioned. But I know that CARB has addressed this in their statement of reasons that accompanies this. So perhaps a little cautious, but it would be interesting to see what others' views are upon this. I hope that answers the question.
Cool. Thank you so much, Ian. So I'm getting a lot of questions whether this webinar will be online, the slides, etc. So yes, we will have a recording available, and you're all on the list, so we'll send it to you. But you can also always go on our website under events, past events. That's where we store all of our webinars, and also the slides will be available right there. Okay, moving on to the next questions. So there seems to be some questions around offshore versus onshore storage sites. So I think that's a question that I can kick over to Alex. Can you talk a little bit about the eligibility of storage sites and whether it's onshore storage only, Alex?
Yeah, thanks, Lee. So yeah, as we mentioned in one of the earlier slides, so the CCS protocol is restricted to onshore sites only. And it's an interesting question, and one actually that we asked when we were drafting the report as to whether and why offshore sites were excluded. My understanding from reading CARB's response to the consultation responses when the CCS protocol was being drafted is that CARB did not have the resource or the time to complete a comprehensive review of the inclusion of offshore reservoirs in the protocol. So that's really the reason why it was excluded this time round. I think there are a few points to note. So firstly, the exclusion of offshore reservoirs may limit the opportunities available, but perhaps not restrict them. So there are onshore resources available in the locations where CCS projects may be deployed to take advantage of the LCFS. And then I'd also note that CARB haven't closed the door on this, or at least that's the impression I get from their consultation response. So they did say in their response that they would consider the inclusion of offshore CCS projects in future if deemed appropriate. So there may be an opportunity in the future for those to be brought into the protocol.
Thank you, Alex. Moving on, lots of questions on location, technical barriers, compliance. So maybe both of you, I think this is a good question for both of you to answer. What do you think are the main barriers for CCS projects to qualifying for the low carbon fuel standard credits?
Shall I try going first, Ian?
By all means.
So, well, I guess in terms of the points coming up there, Lee, location is an obvious barrier. So as we explained, to qualify for the LCFS, projects need to be selling transport fuels into California unless they are a direct air capture project. And the California transport fuel market is actually relatively isolated to the rest of the US. So that may restrict the opportunity for projects outside of California to benefit from the scheme and the opportunity to stack 45Q tax credits and LCFS credits. In terms of, I think you mentioned technical barriers. I guess, one thing, if we look at California, for example, my understanding is that there are no existing CO2 pipelines in California, and therefore there is that potential barrier to deployment there. So you'd need to establish the transport network. And this is one thing we looked at in a recent policy report we did, the challenges associated with establishing the transport and the storage network. So that may be a barrier. And then I guess the other area might be in terms of the cost of compliance. So it's difficult to say how significant this will be, but it's likely to favour those larger projects, or at least the program's likely to favour those large projects that can spread the cost of obtaining and maintaining permanent certification over a larger production base. So I think that's probably it for me. Ian, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add on to that list.
Well, I guess there's the broader compliance. So some of the issues that we touched on in the presentation, the requirements in relation to class 2 and 6 wells is a very interesting area, and something that we looked at in relative detail within the report. There are obviously some clear differences in the requirements for class 2 and class 6 under the UIC program, reporting program, and then in terms of the LCFS, the CCS protocol for permanence. I mean, the only other thing I'd perhaps highlight are any other legal and regulatory barriers to the technology, something that we want to focus a little more on in the forthcoming months. But in individual states, and I noted in my comments earlier around primacy, there is state primacy legislation for EOR operations and also for storage operations. And indeed, in states, there are a number of other provisions relating to things like pore space ownership or perhaps long-term liability, which, while not directly related to this, may impact upon projects. So just the broader regulatory environment is perhaps something to consider.
Perfect, thank you, Ian, and also Alex, obviously. So we're seeing some questions about how the LCFS and especially carbon capture plays into California's climate goals. So as I mentioned earlier, for us from the Institute's view, this is very significant development because it's basically a recognition that if you're en route to a net zero economy, there is a role to play for carbon capture and storage, and we need that technology to scale today to be ready and commercially available at scale. To deliver additional emissions reductions, which will become harder and harder. And I think this is also, from our view, a very innovative way to include carbon capture and storage in to address climate, because obviously California has reached its 2020 climate goals early, largely because of a kind of 35% drop in electricity sector emissions, while industrial and transportation emissions have been largely flat, or I mean, they have obviously reduced in line with the LCFS goals. But what we're seeing is that we're really looking to this as a new incentive structure in a way to address transportation and industrial emissions. And we're also obviously looking to, at some point, having this CCS protocol possibly attached to the state's carbon market, which would be great. Ian, Alex, do you have anything to add to this?
Nothing from me.
Nothing from me either. Thanks, Lee.
Okay, fantastic. So moving on, there are a couple questions on states and other states. Ian, can you maybe highlight some of the differences to other states, or what other states are doing, and also that most states have their own UIC programs. What would the table look like if you looked at the state level requirements instead?
Thanks, Lee. Well, as I suggested during the presentation, and I just mentioned a while earlier, there's a number of states which have primacy for regulating under the UIC program for both 2 and 6. Now, we did some very cursory analysis of class 6 primary applications, and I mentioned before only one state has actually secured it, in North Dakota, and storage specific legislation. And clear from this, there is, there are, a number of state specific provisions or approaches to storage activities which are very different. The Institute is hoping to undertake some work in the next few months or over the next year to review some of the state level activities in greater detail. So that's something we would like to consider consider going forwards, and the interactions with something like the LCFS and the CCS protocol. So an area of which could be potentially very interesting.
Fantastic, thank you, Ian. So, okay, there's some more questions on 45Q and particularly the IRS request for comment. Could you, I guess, Alex, could you maybe discuss a little bit what are the main elements and issues being considered in the IRS consultation, which I think closes on July 4 or July 3?
Yeah, so I think there are a number of issues being considered in that consultation, but there are probably 3 or 4 that are likely to attract most attention. I think I'll leave Ian to talk through those with the more kind of legal focus. I think from my perspective, I think 2 in particular which are interesting issues that are being considered are around the recapture of credits and the transferability of them. So these are 2 themes that will influence the bankability of credits from an investor's perspective. So there are really, when you're looking at the recapture question, there are some real sort of trade-offs between the different approaches that the IRS could potentially consider, between having provisions in place to be able to claim back tax credits to maintain the environmental integrity of the scheme versus the potential negative effect on investment and the utilization of the scheme if the rules are too stringent. So I guess from an investor's perspective, some of the options that would perhaps help to balance this trade-off would be things like the use of safe harbors that, if complied with, would restrict recapture, the use of de minimis rules for when no credits would be recaptured, and allowing flexibility for invalid tax credits to be recovered in future tax years rather than in the year that they are invalidated. And then I guess the other issue, so on the transferability of credits, would be the fact that many capture operators will be tax exempt or won't have a large enough tax liability to be able to take full advantage of the tax credit. So this could affect their ability to attract financing and investment for their project. So having flexibility in the credit transfer arrangements will therefore be important for the effectiveness of the tax credit in supporting the increased employment of CCS projects. And that's one of the areas that the IRS is considering. I think probably the thing maybe that Ian's best place to answer would be the issues around the definition of geological storage, and I think also maybe on construction. So Ian, do you want to say a bit on that?
Yeah, no, thanks, Alex. First, on the first issue, the definition of storage. 45Q requires operators to demonstrate secure geological storage of carbon oxides in order to claim the actual tax credit. And under the IRS consultation proposal, this is going to require operators to have either, as I said before, either a Class 2 or a Class 6 well permit, and an EPA approved monitoring plan, which is required, obviously for all projects reporting under subpart RR. Because Class 2 permit holders are not normally required to report under RR, and therefore are not required to have an EPA approved monitoring plan, one of the things the IRS are seeking comments on is whether there are alternative routes to demonstrating secure geological storage. I know one of the options under consideration is the use of international standards. Many people will be familiar with those, which have been issued by the ISO. But the inclusion of these standards is going to require a rulemaking process, which would push back the point in time between capture operators have certainty over the scheme. So there's a bit of a trade-off underway here. Very quickly, you mentioned construction. What constitutes the start of construction for the purposes of meeting the 2024 deadline? I know there's some other precedents within some other of the tax crediting schemes with definitions there. But CCS projects are of course very different, so there might need to be some changes to definitions. That's everything from me.
Okay, fantastic. I guess we have to move to lightning round because we are a little bit short on time. So there's one question about whether there has been projects announced or what industry is looking at. So yes, there was a project, a direct air capture project, 500,000 tons a year by Occidental Carbon Engineering announced recently, and it is expected that it will be designed to qualify for the LCFS. And as we understand from industry chatter, there's a lot of interest from the ethanol industry, and we're expecting about 6 projects or half a dozen or so over the next 3 years. And that will be significant success of a regulation, given that there's 18 large-scale projects currently. Globally. So then moving to the lightning round, Alex, would enhancer recovery qualify as storage for LCFS?
Yes. So effectively, you can think of the scheme in terms of the capturers and the storers. And storage includes dedicated geological storage or oil reservoirs used for EOR.
Okay, fantastic. It is also some other questions. How does it work with the LCFS and CO2 to fuels?
Good question. And one that I can't remember off the top of my head, so I'm afraid we'll have to come back to the person who asked that question.
Perfect. Okay, please email us. Okay, next question. Where do you see the greatest opportunities for CCS projects to take advantage of the LCFS?
Shall I go for that, Ian?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I guess so. Lee, you mentioned already the direct air capture project and the ethanol projects. So perhaps we'd already covered it from a project perspective, and we are actually planning to do a bit more work looking at this in the coming months to build on the report. So look at where the opportunities lie. I think also, and just reflecting on what you said at the start, the big opportunity is in terms of what could be learned by policymakers in other jurisdictions. So with transportation sector being one of the more challenging sectors to decarbonise, there's potentially a lot to be learned. So it'd be interesting to see how things pan out for the CCS Protocol and CCS projects under the LCFS, and ultimately whether we see other jurisdictions replicating what California are doing.
Okay, fantastic. It's 5 o'clock. Unfortunately, it went by really fast. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Alex, if you could show our email addresses. So if we didn't get to your questions today, please email us. We'd be more than happy to answer them offline. And please also feel free to check out the report, which you can download for free on our website, as well as our project database globally, which is co2re.co core. And yes, thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed the discussion and are more interested in the low carbon fuel standard today. Yeah, thank you so much. Bye.